Okay, welcome everybody. The Adult Adoptee Movement, which you'll hear referred to tonight as ARM, because it's a bit of a mouthful, and the Movement for an Adoption Apology, known as MAA, have come together for the very first time today to show a united front moving forwards, following the UK government's response to the Joint Committee on Human Rights inquiry into forced adoptions, 1949 to 1976, the right to family life. In its response, the UK government has, in fact, acknowledged the violation of our right to family life and also of our human rights. However, it has stopped short of issuing a formal apology, claiming that it is not appropriate to give one, choosing instead to blame local authorities and charitable and voluntary organisations, all of whom were funded by the state. We think it apt that on Mother's Day, a day which is so very painful for all of us, mothers, adoptees, and all of our children and extended families, that we come together to join forces and show the UK government that we are determined to continue our campaigns and that we do deserve a formal apology for historic forced adoption. Both adoptees and mothers have given harrowing written, roundtable and oral evidence to the inquiry, in an attempt to make their silent voices heard, to seek justice, validation, action and reparation. Some have further stuck their heads above the parapet, coming out very publicly to raise and maintain awareness of our campaigns, recording podcasts, giving interviews, hosting webinars, being featured in press articles, writing reports and recommendations has left each and every one of us emotionally exhausted. Some of us are even left at the point that it has taken an irreparable toll on our family relationships. So I hope that sets the scene for this webinar about why an apology matters, and that I've managed to convey just how deep our feelings and emotions about this whole matter can run at times, and how passionate we still all are for the cause, despite this setback. Can I now hand over to Veronica and Diana at MAA to give you their presentation? Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Very good to see you all. Diana and I are going to tell you how we feel about not getting an apology. I will start and Diana will follow. We, the mothers, so many of whom have never been acknowledged as mothers or called that name, seek an apology for all the cruelty, judgment, mistreatment, loss, grief, isolation and trauma we have experienced. We seek remedy for the years we lived in silence, shamed into believing we're all that we had been called by those who should have known better. None of us is naive enough to think that we can recover any part of the lives we might have lived. Those years are gone, taking with them our youth, fertility, opportunities, and all too often hope. Some of us are left with only despair. Our wish is to live the remainder of our lives knowing that the injustice has been recognized with a public acknowledgement that we were never fallen women, rather we were women, and in too many cases girls, who were pushed into believing the stories we were told. Stories claiming that as unmarried mothers, we were irrelevant to the life of our unborn child. Stories which insisted we would each be an impossible burden on the other, and that the only solution was to relinquish our flesh and blood to a family we had never met. In other words, we were obliged to amputate the next generation in order to save them. We now know that was a cruel lie, and for that we deserve an apology. So many injustices are meted out by the medical profession, employees of the state. The adoption journey often began with a visit to a GP in NHS hospitals. Doctors and nurses treat us appallingly, and if we had become lesser beings instead of seeing us as we were, young, terrified girls and women. Procedures and treatment and drugs were all too often administered without consent. They punished us either by withholding pain relief or by ensuring that whatever we did, they did, would guarantee more pain. Our newborns were taken from us in order to prevent crucial bonding immediately after birth. breastfeeding was discouraged or prevented by means of drugs, which years later we know to be contraindicated and potentially carcinogenic. They failed to provide appropriate postnatal care even after we'd received stitches or other surgical intervention. Our silence ensured negligence went unnoticed. Over to you, Diana.
For all of those experiences and the trauma with which we live on a daily basis, we deserve an apology and access to professional, trauma-informed support. For all the times we were ignored, regarded as being no better than a broodmare, our only value being the fetus we carried. For me personally, the term birth mother holds that direct connotation. For the way our feelings were entirely disregarded by employees of the state, medical personnel, social services, churches, awful mother and baby homes, hospitals, adoption agencies, and all those who worked behind the scenes to ensure that the wheels of the gargantuan adoption machine continued to turn. We deserve an apology and an acknowledgement wrong, severing that most precious of connections, the bond between mother and child, and behaving as if doing so would have no impact on us or on our children. For ignoring the cries of helpless infants who later grew into traumatized adults, full of questions as a result of being denied basic information. People who were expected to be grateful for being snatched from the familiar and placed in a home where hypervigilance all too often became the norm. For all of this, we deserve and demand an apology. We cannot hope to regain what was taken from us, yet we have surely earned the right to salvage what remains, to reconnect with blood relatives, to build something meaningful from the ashes of what might have been. Find ways to address our trauma, support one another, and to grieve, grow, and heal where we can. For all of this, an apology, accompanied by appropriate concrete measures of reparation, is the only way forward. Such measures must include, among others, access to trauma-informed counselling with properly trained professionals, preferably fully funded by the state. The means to determine whether any person sought is still alive. And access to medical records in every context. We need to build lasting bridges to span the roiling rivers of grief, pain, and loss we each face. Such measures would help us begin the journey towards healing. It is indisputable that our right to a family life was violated. An apology would provide a welcome salve for our wounds, which will never truly heal. For many of us, a formal apology would offer a new beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana and Veronica. That was ever so powerful. Can I pass over to Michael now? Are you happy to have a talk about how you come at it from academia?
Yes, of course. Thanks very much, Vic. And thank you very much for Veronica and Diana for those very powerful testimonies. I think of all the reasons why the Joint Committee on Human Rights and the process inquiry need to be treated with the kind of review that they deserve, rather than kind of with a degree of disdain that's been handled by the government with the response they've issued. So briefly, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Lambert. I contributed written and oral submission to the Joint Committee on Human Rights inquiry into the forced adoption of the children of unmarried mothers over the period from 1949 to 1976. And the reason I did so was because for the previous 10 years, I've studied the inner workings of the British welfare state and how it operated and came into being, particularly from the period from around 1940 through to about 1980, but it does continue onwards into the present day. And before I say what I'm about to say, mainly about saying things that I can't say. So being a historian who looks at these kinds of records and traces of government, state organization, voluntary society activity, is there are enormous gaps, and it's something that I know other people have written and spoken about, but those inaccessibility of records is also a problem to academic researchers, that we still have the same difficulties, if not with a degree of more privilege because of the status that we hold, but in the fact that a lot of these records are either denied to us or they have significant gatekeeping or control. So that still applies in a more formal sense of getting access to the record. So it's a very officious view that I have. So I'm not going to speak to perhaps some of the bigger issues that were affecting at the time, some of the issues that the report and also the reply spoke to. That is about the ideology of the family, the place of professional expertise, the way in which moral welfare and adoption debates were held at the time. I mean, a lot of people have written about those, and I feel quite concerned that the government effectively dismissed those points and recognised them, but they're there and they warrant investigation and talking about. People have written about them, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the very blunt mechanics almost that mean, and the phrase that Liz used at the start, the phrase that comes across in the response says that, for instance, the government words, "We do not think it is appropriate for a formal government apology to be given," and this is their legitimation, "since the state did not actively support these practices." So if I can ask Dawn just to pop up a slide I presented just to try and talk through effectively why the government is entirely and centrally responsible. So I pieced together this, which is a gross simplification of what went on. I mean, by those kinds of layers, but this is what happened in England and Wales. In Scotland, it's slightly different, again, with the ways that different government departments function, and those are the ones at the top. And again, in Northern Ireland, because of different levels of governance, it is also distinct. What you're looking at here, I've tried to impose some kind of order, are 4, maybe 5 layers. So the very top layer in red, when it's an official government organisation, that is a tax-funded central government department of one shade or another. Those are the ones responsible for making policy, and also getting money from the treasury, which is why they're included, but I can't really go into details about that. And on the furthest hand side, you've got the Church of England. So I've drawn upon the Moral Welfare Association Council because it's the example I'm most familiar with, but this also applies to a whole raft of voluntary organisations involved in adoption, whether it's the Salvation Army, whether it's Diocesan Rescue Societies from Catholic Church. All those are part of the same apparatus. I know the moral welfare example better, and I can't put the others on the page. So that's why I kind of opted for that omission. So what you have at the top level is a series of central government bodies, civil servants within those, and crucially, what in the academic language they call the policy community. So you mentioned the adoption industry earlier, kind of the old-fashioned way of saying that is the adoption policy community. They have been instrumental in each step of the process, both the 1949 and 1976 Acts, in official submissions, but also in formal engagement, but more crucially, and this is the thing that I've put across more recently in social media, is the place of a government circular. So it's got a very boring title, Circular 2866/43. That is, it's a 2,866 circular issued by the Ministry of Health in the year 1943. And that circular was issued by the Ministry of Health, a central government department. It was issued to all local authorities in England and Wales. And there was a very similar one in Scotland, but again, governance dynamics are slightly different. And this circular laid an obligation on every single local authority to provide, and I'll use the term loosely, services for unmarried mothers and their children. The main purpose of this circular was it was during the Second World War, there was a need for more female labour in the wartime economy, and so they put in a series of measures in which to ensure that they maximise the labour potential of unmarried mothers as a workforce. A key part of this at this moment in time was the adoption of young children as this process. It was small in comparison to what would later become the major industry over the 40s and 50s and 60s, but the seeds were there already, that there was not only a legal process in which to go down, but also, crucially, the central government, so the ministry was issuing a circular, but funding for these different kinds of activities partially came from the local authorities, but most of it came from central government. They were the ones that were funding these activities. So that's why I've got this second layer in, that it was then through a filter of the regional officials within each of these areas. So the country's kind of broken into different units. And there's also at that point where the dioceses of the Church of England were involved to make sure that organizations aren't duplicating what the other one is doing, that there's an equitable distribution of resources from their point of view, and to make sure that all of those people involved have got a seat at the table. Again, to deny the state involvement when government and civil servants are directly involved in handling and mediating this process is a denial of historical evidence. The third layer is the government's argument, almost. That is that most of these adoption policies and services were organised and delivered at a local level. And that is undeniably true, because that's where every service happens. They don't happen in Westminster and Whitehall. The distinction the government are effectively making is that local authorities are elected by different bodies. So that's why I put those in green, to kind of make an artificial distinction. So the shades of red are those that have some kind of central government involvement, and the green here is it's a distinct entity, effectively. But that belies the reality of how local authorities worked. Although the councils were effectively responsible for the oversight of the services in their area, so the key three agencies involved with the public health, the education and children's departments in the post-war period, although they were answerable to the local authority, most of their oversight, regulation, guidance, and above all, funding came from central government. That regular inspections took place that ensured that certain amounts of money on a regular basis were in fact being handed over to adoption societies, to moral welfare associations, to the Catholic rescue societies. The central government was ensuring that was taking place, as well as making money available for it. So the other element in this is the hospitals. Complicatedly, they were outside of the local authorities. They had a sort of a separate organization, but in effect, belying the government's argument, there is nothing to stop you as an individual, as part of this process, historically, having your care, effectively, your delivery of the child in a maternity home, in an NHS home, which is directly central government funded, and then managed by an adoption society that's funded through a local authority. In every sense of the level, funding, organisation, dictating the terms of what happened, when and where, that was entirely at the behest of central government. So to kind of come back to it and think they are denying involvement because it was done by local authorities is a complete abnegation, it's a complete denial of the whole policy structure that was taking place right from 1943, when they laid out the financial, political, governmental terms of doing this, right the way through to the 1976 Act, which brought to an end this kind of particular juncture, but didn't obviously end the process entirely. And the reason I've got all these different entities on the slide is to try and show the assemblage of it as well, that at each stage of the process, nationally, regionally, and locally, the different adoption societies, religious organizations, they were also deeply involved in making sure that things happened. And these conversations weren't happening in isolation, that they weren't taking place independently of one another. The kind of government argument is almost that they didn't know about it, or they didn't really have any involvement, which is a complete, again, disavowal of what actually happened. So this diagram is basically trying to say that money, political influence, power, policy, direction, the way the entire system operated under this period from roughly 43, but particularly from 49 to 76, was impossible. It would not have taken place. It could not have happened without the government saying that's what they wanted. And that's, I'll leave it there if that's okay.
That was brilliant. Thank you. We've got a fair bit to get through. The idea is that we're going to put this out on Mother's Day. So I want to start the sort of discussion within the group about talking about Mother's Day. I think it has a different impact for each of our communities. I'm going to start with the mothers, if that's okay. Is it okay to start with Diana and Veronica and just have a little talk with the group about how Mother's Day and the impact of Mother's Day and what it has on you and your feelings that surround it? Sorry.
It's all about feelings, really. It's I don't know, Veronica, do you want to talk first, or shall I just
carry on?
Continue? It becomes, for me, not so much lately, because I have actually worked on this quite a lot to cope, but it becomes a day that I dread, and a day when I just want to get away from all the flowery nonsense that gets spouted on that day, because it is a very painful reminder of all the things I lost. So certainly from a mother's perspective, even though we've never been called mothers, some of us, it is a sense that society ignores people like us because we don't count. So that's my take on it anyway. I don't know if you have a slightly different perspective, Veronica.
Well, for many years, I never allowed myself to be called a mother. I just didn't have that role. And because I didn't really come out until I was 50, all those years from my daughter's losing her was just locked in my head for so long that it came out like an explosion when it actually came out. And all these years I've never, my daughter and I have a very good relationship now, and she does call me her mother, which is wonderful, but it's taken a long time to get there.
Thank you. And I'll just introduce our adoptee speakers tonight, because I haven't introduced them yet, but Dawn and Sally are going to be speaking on behalf of the Adult Adoptee Movement. So I'm just going to hand over to them and give us an adoptee's perspective on Mother's Day, if that's okay.
Want me to go first, Dawn? Well, yeah, it's difficult. I suppose that's the short version. That it's a very complicated day. As an adoptee, you have two mothers, and it reminds you of the mother that, in many cases, many of us never got to meet. I certainly didn't. And it also reminds you of the difference in your own relationship with your adoptive mother compared to friends, relatives who've got biological mothers. And there is a difference in that relationship, which I think for a lot of us, we were kind of told there was no difference when we were children, and there was a lot to be grateful for. In fact, that's where the focus was. And certainly for me, I spent a very, very long time thinking I should be grateful and trying very, very hard to be grateful. And then during adulthood, realizing that actually that gratitude was quite poisonous and quite painful. And so Mother's Day is complicated. I'm a mother myself, so that's the joyful bit of it. But yeah, it brings up lots of complicated feelings. Dawn, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm estranged from my adoptive family, and my mother's passed away. So it's sort of Mother's Day, I have nobody. And I think, to celebrate Mother's Day with a mother that you never got to meet is just so bizarre that for me, I don't know how anyone's really supposed to process that. I mean, I've got my own children, so my focus is always on them on Mother's Day. Because, I think, everybody's, and that's the thing with adoption, isn't it? Everybody's experience of Mother's Day is very different because every adoption story is very different.
Thank you. I mean, the point of us holding this webinar is on the back of the government's refusal to apologise for the forced and coerced adoptions. How would you, both sets of communities, do you feel that an apology would help healing within your respective communities? I'm going to come to the adoptees first this time, if that's okay.
You go first, or you go first?
So I think for us, well, I think, certainly for the adoptee community, an acknowledgement means that, an apology is an acknowledgement. And I see it as a very good starting point to put systems in place so that, we can heal, we can repair, we can have access to the information and services that we need. But for me, most importantly, is the fact that, we were born illegitimate. We then had our identities wiped. And it's like nobody recognises us in society as adoptees. So it would just be hugely validating to actually have our presence acknowledged and to have systems in place that were there to support us. Sally?
Yeah, picking up on Dawn's point, I guess the whole narrative around adoption is that it's a positive thing, that we've all had a marvellous life, a better life than we would have had. And that's a really poisonous thing. And an acknowledgement that what happened to us, an unequivocal recognition that what happened to us and to our mothers was wrong. And it was a wrong of the most heinous kind, would be hugely validating. And so it feels very, very important. And like Dawn, I think for me, it's then about the repair, because once you have an acknowledgement that what happened was terribly wrong, then we can move on and start to think about repair. And the repair part is very, very important to me. It's important to me that for all of us adult adoptees, there's some repair, and for our mothers that there is too. And it also would help shine a light on the harms that adoption has done historically and sadly continues to do. So Dawn mentioned erasure of identity. So just a recognition that that is an issue that we have to struggle with as adoptees. The fact that we've got our medical history has been erased, it would be a recognition of that. Recognition of the fact we've grown up without any genetic mirroring in our families and the difficulties that involves, the feeling that you've been dropped by a stork or came from aliens or whatever, and an expectation of the gratitude, and just lifting that expectation of gratitude and the idea that we've been saved would be a huge relief. And other things like support for mental health, recognition of the trauma that there is involved in growing up as an adoptee. It's very isolating, you're completely silenced, and hopefully some sort of access to better or any trauma-informed adoption competent counselling. So those are all the things that I suppose we'd hope that the an apology would give a springboard for proper repair. It's never going to make it right. I think the birth mothers have said it's never going to be made right, but it could ease some of the difficulties that I guess we all experience. And also it would start to address the issues that current adoptees either will face during their lives or are currently facing. So it's not just about us, it's about the next generation as well.
Thank you. Diana and Veronica, how would...
For me, it would be an acknowledgement that what happened to us, having our babies taken away, is acknowledged, and the apology would validate. You others have said that, but I was extremely lucky when I traced my daughter, and I did have extremely good counselling straight away at the post-adoption centre. I think I would have ended up with long-term care in a psychiatric hospital otherwise. But they really nurtured me and made me feel not good about it, but a bit more at peace. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I would echo much of what's been said. There's so much commonality in terms of the issues. Obviously the issues on each side are different, but the common issues of trauma and of grief and of loss need to be addressed. They need to be acknowledged. They need to be seen. And we would certainly, I think, on our side of things, we would feel vindicated in some way that all those years we were led to believe that we'd done the right thing, or we'd done the best thing, and because we loved our baby, we'd given it to a proper family, and all of that stuff that we were told to have somebody say, we're really sorry that that happened, and we're sorry for our part in it, not just a we're sorry that happened to you, because that would really bug me, but we're sorry for our part in it. What can we do to help you deal with these issues for the remainder of your life? Because they're not going to go away. They can be minimized, perhaps. They can be worked through, but I don't think any of the issues will go away. So an apology would be a salve on the wounds. It would be helpful. It would be a beginning. It wouldn't be where we finish. It would be where we start.
I can also say I'm the anger for my mother is still very raw, even all these years later, that she thought it was okay as well. Heavily influenced by the Catholic Church. I had home was they had plenty of room for me to be there with my baby, and it happened 5 years later. My younger sister lost her baby as well.
I think I would go back to the issue of how much space there was, and certainly the same was true for me. There was plenty of room to accommodate a small child in the large house we lived in. My situation was slightly different in that 10 years after my daughter was taken from me by my mother, my brother and his girlfriend had a baby. They weren't married and they lived in the house. So that was a complete slap in the face. And I think it shows the double standard between what happens to a young girl, and I was very young, and what happens if the boy of the family produces offspring. So I think anything that highlights all the injustices would be really helpful.
Thank you so much. Can't be easy talking about these things, and I do appreciate that. I'm going to come over to Michael next. It's one of my favorite subjects, gaslighting. I've spent an entire day today being gaslit, so I could almost write a book on it. But in some tweets that you put out quite recently, you spoke to how we are gaslighted as a community, as communities. Would you like to expand on that at all?
It's mainly taking I suppose, putting back the point that's been so forcibly put across, that how many times does the government's response say the word sorry? Is it what, 14, 15, something outrageous like that? And yet, in the course of that, they make no effort at all to speak to or consider the very meaningful, tangible things that could be done, should be addressed by the responding to the Joint Committee on Human Rights recommendations, and in a way that it's more harmful. Effectively, it's carrying that same legacy on in a way that there's an option, there's kind of a juncture to recognize that, to stand up and kind of explore it in a meaningful way. But that's clearly not been taken. It's just a rebuttal. It's a rebuffing. It's insulting in the sense that this kind of moments to speak truth to power effectively that being granted through the ability to almost, correct the historical record, to make visible those testimonies that had been missing for so long, because they've been buried, they've been ignored, they've been overlooked, they've been quashed down. And I mean, I cannot imagine what it's like, because it's not an experience that I have, it's not a point of reference that I have. But when you read something and you study something, I can see the kind of harm that it would be inflicted in doing so, and the need to protect the bigger industry, the bigger process, the bigger sets of issues at play. That, for me, is the overriding agenda that comes through in the response that isn't a response. And it leaps off the page for me, but in a way that I find from sort of a research experience point of view, and a professional point of view, that again, from a personal experiential point of view, that I can't possibly grasp. I just find it deeply insulting.
Thank you. I know before the JCHR inquiry, MAA had already put together some recommendations. Is that so that going into the report, you already had recommendations ready? As an organisation, the Adult Adoptee Movement didn't make any recommendations until after the report had been released. However, have you heard anything back from the government about any of your recommendations? Because what I can see from their response, it doesn't reflect any recommendations from either side. Diana, I see you shaking your head, so I'm going to come.
Nothing.
Nothing. I think we're just shaking our heads in dismay. Nothing at all, is there, Veronica? Nothing.
No.
Not even the courtesy of something to sort of address us directly. Nothing at all.
And although I know the answer, Sally and Dawn?
Yeah, we put in our response with 14 recommendations. The driver for that for us was that when we came away from the roundtable event, we actually felt listened to, we felt acknowledged. And then when we heard Azim Zahari giving his evidence, that certainly stoked a different feeling in everybody. And yeah, and it was just to see the report and it was like, no, you've not covered the issues that we were talking about. So we put together our recommendations, and then we were waiting for the government to issue its apology. And we waited and we waited and we waited. So we sort of gave up and we publicised our apology in October, and we launched ourselves via Twitter. Now, we emailed this out to all sorts of people in the government. We emailed it to the Department of Education. JCHR committee were very helpful in making sure that our documents reached the right people. And we got a letter back from the Department of Education that was offered us their deepest sympathy, and that events had changed, and that adoption had changed. And they gave us it was just a standard letter saying, oh yeah, quote this reference if you want to come back to us. Now, we'd spent a lot of time putting this information together. The JCHR committee, the whole thing had taken a lot of time and effort from everybody. We did a freedom of information search for sort of adoption and Department of Education. It turns out the letter they sent us was a copy and paste letter from one that had been sent out previously to somebody who'd inquired. And then Liz had reached out to her MP, who also followed up with the Department of Education to get a reply from them. So, and her MP is Michael Gove. And he got the same letter, yet again, another copy and paste. And this time I think Gillian Keegan had put a nice personal paragraph on the bottom that meant absolutely nothing. But that's three times we've seen this copy and paste letter. And we think that's the respect that they show to a JCHR inquiry. And that's the respect that they show to us. Words absolutely fail me. We live in a democracy, and we're talking, there was 500,000 adoptions in that time period, and that is a population the size of Liverpool, and they reckon that 185,000 were forced, which I think is probably on the low side. And I just think for them to treat people like that is just disgusting.
Well, I have to tell you, early on in our campaign, we did write to every MP, and the ones that replied, as you say, copy and paste exactly the same letter came back from each of them.
Yeah. See, we'd asked for a meeting with Gillian Keegan as well. We asked for that on the 7th of November. On the 24th of November, we had an email saying that they've requested a meeting and they'll be back in touch with us in due course. My MP, Neil O'Brien, he's followed it up twice for me. Michael Gove had a response, but Neil O'Brien obviously didn't warrant a response from the Department of Education. So yeah, so that's it. I just can't believe that in a democracy people can behave like that. Sally, have you got? I'll come off my rant.
Well, that was a very, very comprehensive answer, Dawn. Only a couple of things to add, just on the MP point. So we have all written to our MPs, and just to illustrate, I suppose, again, that what feels like lack of respect that we're getting back, particularly given it was JCHR inquiry, and it did find there was a violation of human rights. And I had a response last week from my MP, who's the Labour MP, just saying it's not a priority and I won't be looking at it any further. So, yeah, I think that's quite representative of the response we've had and the feeling that then leaves you with, that actually you are just completely marginalised, completely silenced. And it's difficult to get anybody to listen. And that does seem shocking to us, I think, on the back of it, the finding of the inquiry being, yes, it was a violation of human rights. So, yeah, I think I'm still slightly stunned by the way the government is behaving. It is rather shocking.
Thank you. The next question is shamelessly stolen from another adoptee, but I really like it because it just gets people thinking a little bit. If you had infinite resources, so if you didn't have to worry about where the money came from and where you directed it, if you had infinite resources, what would you like to see done first? I'm going to go to Sally and Dawn first.
I think I kind of touched on that earlier when I talked about repair. So I think as a group, we've identified 3 things that we were particularly keen on doing something about first. So mental health, I think, is our top priority, and there's lots and lots of things that could be done there. There's access to trauma-informed therapy, lots of therapy that's out there. The quality of it, what it actually includes, doesn't really address adoptee needs. So there's a whole thing around training for therapists, and actually perhaps having some criteria for adoption competent therapy that are developed by adult adoptees who can actually advise based on their experience what that trauma-informed therapy should involve. So mental health is certainly, I think, the #1 priority, but there are many strands to that. So it's actually having the right therapy available, and then it being accessible and it being affordable for people. So I think that's the top one. And then we've got 2 other priorities which Dawn might want to say something about. One is like to have some sort of NHS tick box, so that the life events, the outcomes for adoptees are tracked and measured, so that appropriate action can be taken to support adoptees. And the third one is actually recognising that adoption itself and living as an adoptee is a traumatic thing, and is an adverse childhood experience, and something that continues to affect you and impact on you throughout your life. And just having that recognition would be the basis for a lot of change. But Dawn, you might want to add something to those.
Yeah, I think definitely we definitely need to have some form of access to our medical history, to our family medical history. I think the way that how is it ethical that privacy is prioritized over our actual outcomes. It doesn't, there can be anonymity, but at the same time, we need to have something where we've got a continual feed of conditions, because a snapshot in time doesn't really help us. And we're all coming to the age now where we're sort of coming into various government screening programs. Every time you go to the GP, it's, have you got a family history? There's no sensitivity in this, which is why we want to have some form of tick box, some sort of flag on our records, so that people can be educated and can actually deal with our needs properly. And this isn't expensive. you know, this is something that could be done, but this is why we need the apology so that people actually understand. And when it comes to sort of the infinite pot of money, I really feel that there is a complete conflict of interest when you've got agencies who are up to their neck in managing adoptions, providing support for adoptive, you know, for adopters, and they know nothing about the lives of an adult adoptee. We've had a number of discussions with some agencies, and it's quite frightening how little they understand. They have determined for themselves what they think our needs are. They've got no way of knowing what our needs are because our outcomes have never been monitored. But they've all established for themselves what they think our needs are. And if we say, no, actually, that's not what we need this, then either it's like, oh, we hadn't thought of that, or, oh, you're just being unreasonable, because a lot of people are very happy with the support that we're providing. So we need to have an independent body to look after the needs of the adoptees and also of the mothers as well. You know, this needs to be done properly. We shouldn't just be an afterthought for other agencies and just using us to gain more money to feed back into the adoption industry. It's wrong.
Thank you. Diana and Veronica, what would you do with your infinite pot of
I would
money?
say easier access to records on both sides. I get messages quite frequently of someone who's I've been adopted, or no, I gave birth in 19 whatever, and I want to trace now. What do I do? And well, the answer is I always tell them to go to social services first, but if they go there, they're told there's a waiting list and it's going to cost you X amount. And then you'll have to wait probably 3 to 6 months before we can find your records. And then some of them get told they'll be burnt in a fire or flooded in a basement. And so frustrating that it can't be much easier to find the records and do the job.
Absolutely.
Yeah. With endless resources, infinite resources, a lot could be accomplished. And I think mental health is certainly one of the aspects that applies on both sides. I think we would need some kind of comprehensive database. It doesn't have to identify each individual exactly, but there would be a way of correlating each side so we can work out whether the person we're looking for is still with us or has moved on to other realms. And there is no mechanism to do that. There's nothing that gives anyone any indication. So sometimes people are searching and they spend lots of time, lots of money, lots of emotional energy looking for someone who has already died. And I think that is a huge tragedy, and it need not happen. It could be dealt with if there was the means to implement some kind of tracking, some kind of database, proper records. But there's an awful lot of record keeping that simply doesn't happen, or, as has been mentioned, you know, the fires and the floods and the mishaps that happen with paper records, and sometimes I think with digital ones as well. But I do think also the medical record issue is a huge one. So even if people are not identified on this database that I have in my phantom world of wonderfulness, I think some comprehensive access to medical information is an absolute no-brainer. Why can't people have access to their medical history through their blood relatives? Just you know, even as a courtesy, let alone as a medical necessity. It just seems absurd that that's not available. And I think the whole issue of some kind of care and support and mechanisms to guide people through the absolute quagmire of emotions would be very welcome. But we don't have infinite resources, so it's still pie in the sky, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I mean, I think to put a sense of perspective on it, we had a pony on loan once, and it came with a horse passport. That pony had more information about its medical history than I've got.
Oh, wow.
Before I pass over to Liz for a conclusion, I just wanted to come back to Michael and see if there's anything else that you had to add before we go to questions and answers and whatnot.
Oh, thanks, Vic. It's mainly, I think, to say that the decision not to issue an apology is clearly a very political decision that's been made about that, about delimiting any sense of responsibility, that even, beyond kind of your wildest dreams kind of resources for support, these kinds of additional ways of responding to the harm that's been inflicted, even going some way towards that is an important step. And this is a very big decision from their point of view to act in that way. To put it in a broader perspective, I think it's also about putting the issue from their point of view off, because the example that I'm always taking to about apologies, about some kind of recognition for the harm that's been inflicted in very comparable circumstances in terms of the murky relationship between the government and other organisations is child migration. And the arc of that is Margaret Humphreys back in the 1980s, speaking and interacting with child migrants who were kind of looking for their relatives, right the way through to the publication of a book in the 1990s, and then the Health and Select Committee inquiry in 1998. And it wasn't until 2010, so some 20 years plus down the line, that an apology was issued as one of the last acts of the Labour government by Gordon Brown. So within that arc, a lot of people who could have benefited from some kind of apology, some kind of resourcing, some kind of compensation, some kind of any additional support, and that's gone, and that kind of opportunity has been missed. And for me, I see a role, an important role, in ensuring that the government doesn't repeat that, holding them to account and saying that the archival record, the written record, your own record shows your complicity in this. You have a case to answer, and that needs to be answered now before it's too late, effectively. Because there's a sense almost of the it's like the legalism of these kinds of inquiries. And I think of the Irish example around the modelling nurseries, modelling laundries in Ireland, where within the inquiry, they've been although they've had this same process of taking testimony, speaking back to the strong institutional power of the Catholic Church, that the accounts have been very dismissed in the official inquiry narrative, which I find both, again, that same process of gaslighting, inflicting further harm. And there's a way that I see a role effectively of supporting the legitimacy of what you are saying collectively, that it's not just a private harm inflicted on a one-off incident. It's not just a case of a few bad apples in a few bad areas. It's a systematic process, and there needs to be a reckoning now. And that's really my kind of reason for being here, if I'm completely honest. I think I'm not part of that experience. I'm not part of the harm that's been inflicted, but I have a role and duty as somebody who researches this area to make sure that action is taken.
Thank you so much. It is good to have allies. I'm gonna hand over to Liz, who's just gonna do a little conclusion, and then I'm gonna ask Joe if we've got any questions from chat, and then throw the floor open for maybe one or two questions before I stop recording. So Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Vic. Yeah, so to wrap up this part of the webinar, I just wanted to say thank you to the attendees for coming to watch, listen, and to share this poignant webinar with us. Special thanks again to Professor Michael Lambert, who's given us his expert knowledge and opinions and been so supportive of our cause right from the start. Huge thanks again to Veronica and Diana and all at MAA, and also to Sally and Dawn for speaking for the Adult Adoptee Movement. And I just want to say, as Michael's just said, the time is still now to put things right. We will not stop campaigning. We will not stop fighting for justice, for our rights, for the UK government to apologise formally for its part in these shameful historic practices. So onwards and upwards. Thank you.
And is there anything you'd like to add to that, Diana and Veronica, before I go over to questions?
No, I echo everything Liz has said.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got my suit of armor ready, happy to campaign and go into battle with you. Mm.
Thank you. Joe, have you got any questions from chat before I throw the floor open?
Not really any specific questions, but hopefully people will dive in with those in a minute. But I did just want to flag a couple of really interesting comments that have been made. A couple of people commenting just on the depth of trauma for the mothers, and that there were some who were so traumatized that they didn't even remember the birth, which is really kind of striking. Also a note perhaps to remember that we should be thinking also about some of the fathers. We know that some of them did fight, some of them didn't know but would have fought, so important to remember them too. And then a comment that really struck me, which was that an apology is a way to tell our families what we can't. I thought that was a really really important statement.
Thank you. Okay, so if there is a put your hand up function on Zoom, so if you've got any questions or comments that you're happy to say on camera, because I'm going to turn the camera off in a couple of minutes, then if you could put your hand up now, otherwise I will turn the camera off.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and this, I'm sure it doesn't just apply to me, that in my case, my natural brother lives in America. He's an American citizen simply because my mother fled the trauma of the shame of what happened to her and had to rebuild a life over there. So he's an American citizen and he's autistic. He can't function on his own. He loves me, he speaks to me every day on Skype. He wants to live with me one day. I can't go to America, and he can't come here. So, you know, and I'm not well either at the moment. So we're just on either side of the ocean and we can't be together. I can't even visit them at the moment. So I'm sure that I'm, you know, not the only adoptee that has this. We're not even on intra-country adoptees. It's not an inter-country adoption. It's a matter of what happened to the mothers. It was so bad that some people tried to rebuild a life somewhere else. They were so traumatized. So I just thought I'd throw that into the mix, as it were, for food for thought, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a real issue for a lot of people, and again with adoption, there's so many different layers of complexity, and you know, we've got issues as well where birth fathers aren't on birth certificates. Their names are all in the paperwork, but for example, on my original birth certificate, my birth father's name's not there. And so there's cases where, yeah, people can't get proper access because the documentation wasn't filled out correctly in the first place. You know,
Yeah,
it's, I mean, just like
the way that birth certificates were registered in this country, an awful lot of adoptees have got father unknown. And, you know, personally speaking, my father died in Jamaica during COVID. There was absolutely no way that I was going to be, his sister was in this country, even though she lives in Jamaica, she couldn't leave the country to go and tend to her dying brother and bury him because of the COVID restrictions.
Yeah.
So as an adoptee who's doesn't have his name on my birth certificate or any real recognition outside of a DNA test that he is actually my father, there was no hope of me being able to hop on a plane and take off to a different country. And I know from within the group, I'm not the only one who faces those sort of challenges. Is there any more questions before I turn the camera on? Okay, I want to say thank you to everybody who's participated this evening. It's not easy opening yourself up and sharing your story. It leaves a scar each time you do it. So I really want to thank everybody who's shared their stories and their time this evening. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to turn the camera off now, and we'll sort of go into a general discussion and see where that takes us. Thank you. Can you stop recording as well, please, Liz?